Hello, I'm Juliet Chastney, Project Manager for the Lishore Project. Welcome to this webinar, Feeling an Outsider Within Your Own Organisation. It's great to have you today. If you'd like to quickly say hello in the question and answer section and say where you're from while I'm speaking, that would be great. This is the fourth in a series of 6 webinars on topics relating to spirituality and religion as experienced by ethnically diverse NHS staff during the COVID-19 pandemic. These webinars are part of the Lishore Project, which is a study funded by NHS England, and we have been conducting consultation groups with ethnically diverse NHS staff up and down the country to explore their experiences and guide us towards the topics for these webinars. How today's event will work is our speakers will have a discussion with each other for the first 30 minutes or so, then we will open up to questions and answers. Everyone attending this webinar has their camera turned off and their microphone on mute. If you would like to ask a question of our speakers, please type into the Q&A section and the questions will be moderated by Safis, who you will see a bit more of later. Please type your questions in as soon as you think of them while we're still talking, as there is a delay before we can respond. All of these webinars are being recorded and will be available on our webpage later. Our speaker for today is Dr. Brian Nyatanga, who is a senior lecturer at the University of Worcester. He has worked in the NHS, independent hospices and palliative care settings for the past 3 decades. He is also a visiting senior academic at Edith Cowan University, Perth, Western Australia. Brian was born in Rhodesia, which later became Zimbabwe after independence from British rule in 1980. Grew up on a farm and enjoyed life with his Christian family of 11 siblings, so used to sharing and caring. His early life involved walking long distances everywhere, primary school, church, playing sports, having a bath in the river and family gatherings. Brian moved to the UK in 1986 to train as a nurse and then specialised in palliative care, culminating in a doctoral PhD in 2011. In 2013, Brian developed a Centre for Palliative Care and became the centre's lead for 6 years, conducting research projects. Brian has published extensively in Nursing Press since 1988, including books and book chapters on palliative care topics. He is currently the consultant editor of the International Journal of Palliative Nursing. Thank you for being with us today, Brian. Joining him in conversation is Reverend Dr. Guy Harrison, Director of the Oxford Centre for Spirituality and Wellbeing and Project Lead for the Lishore Project. Over to you, Guy and Brian.
Thank you very much, Juliet, and I'd like to add my welcome to you, Brian. Thank you so much for being prepared to speak at this webinar. Really grateful to you. As you can see, the subject of the webinar is feeling an outsider within our own organisation. I think I can think of nothing worse than feeling as if I'm outside, particularly within an organisation that is predicated on working as a team, working with patients, supporting patients. So Brian, tell us a little bit more about why you think, ethnically diverse people particularly feel that they're outsiders within, I suppose, within an NHS context particularly. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, thank you, Guy, and thank you, Juliet, for the introduction. First of all, I think it's important to just say that what I'm going to be saying here, some of it came from our participants, and also that some of the participants did not all feel outside their organization, but I think it's important to focus on those who felt like they were outside of their own organization. And I think as a starting point, why would people feel that way? Because if you're ethnically diverse, so there is something different about you, visibly different, your skin tone. There might be verbally different in terms of accents and English not being your first language. And those things already are, if you like, things that set you apart from the other person. And within the organization then coming into it with those kind of things, you then feel the need to be welcome. And if that is not forthcoming, that can actually make people feel like they're not part of that. And like we heard from some of our participants, they felt that there was an extra level of scrutiny on whatever they did when they were working within the organizations, and that added this pressure of saying, why is there that extra scrutiny, and what are they looking for? And of course, there are also issues about not being understood in terms of your beliefs, your practices, your religion that you practice, and so on and so on. And all those kind of things, make them feel as if they were outside their organization. And I think it's also important to say this is a feeling. It may not come to be true, but the fact that people feel that way, I think it's important for us to actually try and understand why that might be.
Thanks, Brian. And I guess in that sense, that's needing to belong, needing to be part of a group, needing to be part of a place where you feel confident, where you feel as if you are accepted and understood, and where difference is celebrated. Say a bit more about that need to belong, which is inherent to all of us.
Yeah, you broke off a little bit with your question there, but I'm sure the gist of it was about how people feel they need to belong to the organization. Yeah.
Yes.
So I think the other thing to think about in terms of that is belonging is something quite complex, and it goes back to some of the ideas that we heard from Dr. Ria Patel in our last webinar, where she was talking about identity. So identity is part of belonging. When you know your identity, who you are, and that then builds on to how you can belong to different organizations, different people. And what some of the participants were telling us, that in order for them to feel that they belong, they had to be seen to work twice as hard as the people who are not ethnically diverse. And that, I think, is also something that probably I grew up with, being told that you have to work twice as hard just to be seen as equal, and to be invited into the community, to be invited into society. So you had to work twice as hard, and that is actually putting pressure on people, because they have to work twice as hard. And if you didn't do that, then you may not belong to the organization. And of course, that also challenges how you may succeed, how you may go up the ladder. And when you belong, it also reinforces your identity of who you are, and that you're actually part of what's going on within the organization. I hope that sort of answers part of that question, Guy.
Well, very, very definitely. I suppose in that sense, so the subtleties that go alongside that, so that actually belonging can be something. You can belong to a particular ethnic group, you can belong to a particular organization, you can belong to a faith tradition. But if you are finding yourself in a place where you have to work twice as hard as anyone else, and that to be able to do that, your whole sense of belonging is threatened, I suppose. Does that then what do we need to do to be able to somehow support colleagues who find themselves in that context, in that place?
Yeah, I suppose the key here is that this feeling of alienation, because you don't feel like you belong, is that feeling that you're alienated. So if you can imagine what normally happens as we grow up, we like to form what we call attachment bonds with people. And in relationships, we form what we call affectionate bonds with people. And that means there's something that is shared. So how can we help staff to feel that they belong, to feel that they share things that happen within the organization? So there is things like being involved in the planning of activities, being involved in policy making, decision making, consultation on what happens in their organization that then can actually impact on their day-to-day work. So if you feel you're being included in those kind of decisions, then naturally you begin to feel part of the organization, you begin to feel as if you belong. And this stretches from, the top person in the organization right to the bottom. People need to feel they belong. And like I said at the beginning, if you are different in the way you look, then it's even harder to feel that you belong. So if we're going to do something, then it's to make sure that there is representation at different levels, and especially at these key strategic places where decisions and policies are made.
And what part would you say that, I mean, obviously our communication skills, our understandings one of another, and how we seek to sometimes ask some of the more difficult questions of each other. How do you think we should do that? Or, I mean, it's a complex area, I know, but you've got some clues as to how we do that.
Yeah, it's interesting actually. You ask about communication skills, because what we've learned by studying advanced communication skills is that there is what we call non-verbal leakage. So non-verbal leakage is where what we are saying does not match what our body language is saying, and there is that kind of disharmony, and people tend to pick that up very quickly. That you may be very, in your speech to me, you may be very welcoming, but your whole persona, the way your body language is responding to me is very different. It's actually telling me that you don't want to be near me, you just want to be going now. And so those non-verbal leakage, we have to be aware of that, and we have to address them as well. Of course, when we communicate, it's down to how people interpret what we say. So we had a participant who said to us, when I speak with my Russian accent, patients want to know where that is from. And then you begin to think, well, is that inquisitive or is that discrimination? And again, depending on how it's said and the context of the conversation and so on, you could end up interpreting that in either way, that it could have been discriminatory or it actually was somebody really curious wanting to know. So the point there is that our communication has to be open, unassuming, and at times we tend to be too politically correct that we don't even actually ask the important questions about people that we should, because that's the way society works now. We have to be extra careful and be politically correct. But the other thing we also need to think about is because when we communicate, it's a two-way process, and you have to realize that the other person is also part of that conversation. Otherwise, it ends up one person telling the other person what to do, and that might not be really effective or progressive in terms of what we want to achieve.
Thanks, Brian. And in that sense, though, I guess in terms of our communication and our ability to be able to communicate one with another, there is the real danger of we've heard in the project, in terms of the research, the experience of many staff, ethnically diverse staff particularly, where there are microaggressions, so-called microaggressions come into, they're small, apparently seem to be small things, but actually they are highly significant in the effect, the emotional effects, and the effect on people in terms of their whole sense of themselves and their place in the organisation. Can you say something?
Yeah. Thank you, Guy, for that question. again, you're breaking off, but you were asking about microaggression and how that might impact people within
Yes.
the work environment. Yeah, I think as a starting point, if we were to talk about microaggression, we have to also understand unconscious bias, because those two things tend to work hand in hand, because they are subtle in their in the way they happen, and at times people may not actually be aware that they're being microaggressive, and therefore, similarly with unconscious bias, the people involved may not actually be aware that they're involved, they're being biased. And these are some of the things. I mean, it just doesn't happen to white people. It actually happens to other people as well. Like, you know, myself, for example, the first time I was reading about, you know, black professors, I had the internal conflict to actually learn that, you know, black people could be professors. Yeah, so that internal conflict I had at the time is probably unconscious bias, because you're not used to knowing that they could be actually black professors. But you know, I was reading about this American, probably the sixth person in America, Edward Boucher, who was the sixth American person to hold a PhD in physics. And to me, my own head, that was creating all sorts of, you know, debates about that can't be right. You know, black person equals physicist, you see. So again, unconscious bias. And so when we talk about that, it's not just about, you know, white people being that, but it's about not actually fully understanding some of these the facts. Microaggression is very subtle. That it's again behaviors or things that people say. And if you had somebody, you know, who was talking to you, and all of a sudden you seem to be abrupt and not giving them space to talk, so all those little things might actually suggest how you feel about that person and how microaggressive you may be. And when that happens repeatedly, of course, it builds up to bigger things. And that, I think, is the issue here, that when we talk about microaggression, they end up building into bigger things, and so we have to be careful and to try and manage that.
Thank you, Brian. And do you think unconscious bias can be, you know, we talk about unconscious bias training quite a lot, and I've heard mixed views on that. Do you think we can be taught? Can we find out that way? I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
I think we can be taught, but the other thing, when you teach people, it's whether people are prepared to learn. So it's a two-way process again.
Yes.
Yeah. So we can be taught, but also we have to be prepared to learn. The other point, I think, is when we have a realization, like I've just given you an example here of my own unconscious bias. So people, we have to be able to actually say, this is what I felt, and be honest about it, because that way we then begin to deal with the issues. So I think training is important, because it highlights areas of aggression, areas of tension, areas of disagreement. And at times it might just be that people have got different values, belief systems, and when we begin to understand those differences, then it begins to make sense in us that we cannot all be the same, we are different. So the point then is, how do we use our difference in an effective way, our collective difference? And I think it's important to be different, but it's how we use that difference in a constructive, effective way for the benefit of others.
And I guess it's also, isn't it, about how we celebrate that difference and you know, can affirm it and feel confident in being able to do so. But it takes me back to what you were saying earlier around not being afraid of being politically correct. We need to be honest and open, and sometimes take a risk.
Yeah, indeed. And if we are honest, then people we are talking to, even if we make mistakes, they actually appreciate that we were trying, rather than not being honest and then end up offending people. And I think, yes, it is important that as a society, as an organization, we're open and we know the individual as a person first, and then that individual is unique, and we have to understand that. What makes them tick might be quite different from the other person, and we have to appreciate that. And I think in some cases, we put blanket policies, blanket things that need to happen, and forget those individual differences. And that while it's a policy that it needs to be delivered, the way it's put into operation can actually relate to those individual differences. And I think at times as organizations, that's something we have to do to try and address the needs of all people involved.
Thanks, Brian. And we've talked a little bit about the microaggressions, but there is also the wider organisation that, where we look at our boards or our leadership, and we're not seeing the ethnically diverse context that we need to feel that confidence and that sense that actually we can work in this organisation and be part of it and belong to it. How do we kind of address the need to be able to be a truly diverse workforce? Because of course, as you said earlier, for ethnically diverse people who don't feel excluded, then their careers are hindered, potentially aspirations are denied. How do we I mean, these are really difficult questions, I understand, but in terms of the clues, how as an organisation we need to kind of address these things. Can you say something about that?
Yeah. Thank you, Guy. I think you touch on a really important point here, because the way our organizations look is very important in its intentions to address the need of everyone. So, as an example you've just given there with micro level aggression, is what kind of image do we have at the top table? Who represents ethnically diverse people at the table, on the top table? And what I'm saying here is that there needs to be a process that enables that kind of mobility to the top table. I'm not for 1 minute suggesting that we should put people up the top table for the sake of it. That to me becomes tokenistic. So what we need to do is to prepare people, get them ready to do the job that is required at that top table. Now that top table makes policies, it makes decisions that impact on our lives, it impacts on what we do, and it impacts on the people that we serve. So if we're going to address macro level aggression, then that's something we have to do. If you don't see somebody who looks like you at the top table, does that act as a hindrance, or does that actually make you more ambitious that you want to get to that top table? So if the latter was the point, then what are the mechanisms in place to actually get that redressed? Now, I may be speaking out of turn here, but most ethnically diverse people have the qualification to sit around that top table. So the issue is, why doesn't that always happen? I was looking the other day in academic circles in terms of like universities and so on, and looking at how many black professors are there and so on and so on, and it's not a huge percentage at all compared to other races, if you like. So there's a very small, something like 7% of professors in the UK are black, and then the rest 69% and 10% are Asian, I think, background. So there is that bit that needs, addressing. And when you then look at what are the qualifications, you find that quite a lot of ethnically diverse people hold, the qualifications that are needed to progress. So the question is, why isn't that happening?
So actually, working out why that's happening, addressing the fact that certainly in terms of proportionate, so an organisation that perhaps has, I don't know, 20% ethnically diverse staff, although actually many healthcare organisations are far larger in terms of the proportion related to the population, aren't they? So we may well have significant numbers of ethnically diverse staff in the so-called lower banded workforce, and then minimal numbers at a higher level, which clearly needs to be addressed, and reporting on it is not sufficient. How do we? We talked earlier about the strength of feeling that amongst many staff of all ethnicities, that actually we're still all these years on, still haven't quite addressed some of the real challenges, in terms of bullying and harassment, in terms of feeling excluded, which make any member of staff who caught up in that, their feelings are going to be a very powerful and potent and disabling place to be, isn't it?
Yeah, indeed. And thank you, Guy, for making that point. You probably make it better than I would have, actually. So there may be a number of factors we could, look at in terms of what stops this upward mobility in terms of career progression, aspirations being met with people who are ethnically diverse, particularly in this country. And some of our participants, again, related to some of the hindrances that they come across when they're applying for jobs, when they're applying for promotion, and so on and so on. And I have come now to actually associate that with what I'm beginning to call the knee phenomenon. And I mean, we know about George Floyd and that, the way he was killed. So that knee on George Floyd is actually kind of, when you look at what happens in terms of career progression, promotions, jobs, and so on, there is another kind of need that's happening within the workforce and the participants that we're talking to that suffocates their opportunities, it disadvantages them, and even those with high qualifications, they were saying they don't always get the guidance and the support to get to the next level. So again, that's some of the things that need addressing. And they were also saying that if you then have grievances that you want raised to address some of these issues, then the people who end up looking at your grievance are the same people who are seen as the perpetrators of the issues. So you cannot have a system that investigates its own problems and try and find solutions to that. So again, there is an area there that could be addressed, and you want people to feel confident that they're being treated, they're being promoted because of who they are or what they present, not anything else. Or if I went for a job and I didn't get it, I don't want to come back thinking, was it because of who I am, or was it because something else? I have to come back thinking I didn't get it because I was not good enough. Yeah, and if that was the case, I think I would live with it, and most people I think would do as well. I hope that answering some of your questions, Guy.
Oh, very, very definitely. Thank you, Brian. I think I'm going to ask you one final question. Before I do so, could I encourage people to put their questions into the chat for Brian? We have a period of time when we're going to be able to ask questions of Brian, and possibly even of me. It has happened before. that would be great. Please do that. But in terms of just wrapping up this first half hour, Brian, are there particular tips that you, I mean, in terms of all that we've talked about, in terms of feeling an outsider within our own organisation, which, as I said at the beginning, is probably one of the most powerful and alienating features, if that's what you're experiencing, and we talked about the strength of feelings. What, how do we address those really difficult feelings? Because it's a very personal. It's very personal, isn't it? It's not just the organisation sort of doing something that is clearly disabling me in some way. It's a personal thing. It's about power, and that power imbalance. How do we kind of, just as a final comment, Brian, how do we kind of address those power imbalances?
Yeah, so there are a number of things I think we can look at, and thanks, Guy, for that question. There are a number of things we can look at. So there's the power that exists within organizations, but there's also the power of feelings within people who work for the organization. So first and foremost, it's important for the organization to believe how people feel. You cannot argue with how people feel. You have to believe that, because at times when people tell the organization how they feel, they're not believed at times, and that stops then people coming back next time because nobody is listening. So we have to believe people's feelings. So then why do people feel the way they do? So we need to understand that. So any feelings at work of not being valued, not being part of the organization, there must be a reason to explain that. Yeah. Now, if people don't feel supported at work, why is that? And at times, actually, people have solutions. If we only ask them, so what would you want to happen for you to feel supported? And people actually have solutions, because they work within the organization, they see what's going on, and they can always begin to give us some ways forward in terms of that. And if you look at opportunities that come to everybody who works in the organization, yeah, do people get those opportunities equally, or are they already handpicked for certain people? So all those things need to be looked at. If you're going for promotion to the next level, there has to be guidance in terms of what you need to be promoted to that level. If you want to go into management, what is it that you need to prepare yourself to get to that level, rather than, okay, there is an opportunity here to be a manager and you're not prepared, so the other people who are prepared end up getting that job. And I think if we start to do that and listen to people, we may begin to create this equality we so desperately need in our organizations and in society at large. And we have to customize the support we give to people, not one solution covers everyone. We have to customize that, because like I said earlier, we are unique individuals, and therefore we have unique needs that need organizations to look at. For me, equality is not giving everybody a cup of coffee. Yeah, what we need to do is to give everybody a drink of their choice. That is true equality. If people want a drink, we just don't give them coffee. Everybody has coffee. No. What type of drink would they like? And you do that, then we could begin to feel as if we belong, and we're all having a drink together of our choice.
Brian, that's a wonderful way to conclude the conversation. Thank you very much for that. It's like equality of opportunity, giving people a choice is a real vision, a real sort of sense that we can move on. So please, I'm wondering if we have any questions for Brian.
Yes, we have a couple of questions. Okay, so the first question is, well, to start off, thank you for a very interesting conversation, both to Brian and Guy. And the question is for Brian, have you yourself experienced feeling an outsider in your work setting? If yes, how did you deal with it?
Right, that's a very, very interesting, good question as well. Well, as you know, I've been working for different organizations, and at some point, yes, you feel like you don't belong. And when that happened to me, I had a conversation with my immediate line manager, who ended up becoming my mentor because I think he was equally open and interested to know what really affects me in the organization. So I was very open to say this is how I felt because of what had happened. And after that dialogue, then this line manager said he was going to try and put things into place, you know, to try and support and also at the same time educate where the problem was coming from. Because I think, you know, some people may make you feel like you don't belong, not intentionally, but because they're actually genuinely not aware of what they're doing. So again, I always talk about this two-way process, that you help the person feeling that and you help the person who makes the other person feel that. And that's how, you know, I can relate to that as a personal experience. That yeah.
Thank you very much, Brian. Sophie, so we have another question.
We do indeed. How can organizations better identify that some of their staff feel like outsiders? It may not be easy for someone to share this sentiment, so how do you suggest overcoming this particular barrier? Thank you, Brian.
Yeah, again, when people feel free enough to express how they feel without any fear of, you know, reprisals or you know, being affected in their job, then people will explain to you what the issues are. I believe that genuinely, that if people are given genuine freedom to express how they feel, they will. And then when they do that, then it's what we do to address it. What I times think, and also listening to the participants in the study, is that people, you know, people working in organizations don't feel that they can say exactly how they feel because of what might happen next time, and that they may then be targeted because they're, you know, they're complaining or they're making it difficult for their line manager. So it's things like that that, you know, we have to build trust within each other, and we have also to accept that we are in this organization for one thing, yeah, to save our patients. If we're, in my case, in university, we are there to serve our student population. So whatever we are saying, it's about helping that end goal so that we can do our job properly and we can help and support students. And in clinical practice in the NHS, it's about supporting those patients and the people who they deem important in terms of their relatives and families and friends. So that, I think, for me would be one way, but I'm sure a Guy with his experience might have something else to add on that.
Thank you, Brian. It's the barriers, isn't it? It's how we overcome those barriers. We're identifying what the barriers are first, I guess, is the crucial area, and you've very helpfully identified some of them for us. And then what do we do about it? And we have, you know, we can come up with lots of action plans. all sorts of ideas and thoughts, but actually when it comes down to it, it's about relationships, isn't it? It's about establishing good rapport, good relationship, supporting one another in asking each other those difficult questions, being prepared to be challenged respectfully, and having the wisdom to understand what some of those microaggressions might be about, whilst rejecting them. And whilst, you know, it's easy for me to say that as a white British person in a place of privilege, but for me, I too have responsibilities in terms of understanding I want to be part of a diverse and truly diverse and equally gifted organisation where people's gifts and abilities are recognised across all ethnicities and cultures and faiths and beliefs. So that would be my sort of response. Sophie, have we further question?
Yes, we have another question from Andrew. Thinking about what Brian said about finding our own unconscious bias and being honest about it, how do we create a culture which doesn't implicitly discourage this?
Which doesn't implicitly say that bit at the end?
Discourage this.
Wow, that's a very difficult question. How do we encourage a society how do we have a society that doesn't implicitly discourage it? Yeah. So I think this goes wider than just organizations we're talking about. I think it goes wider into society and those people who have influential positions. And here I'm going to touch a little bit on the newspapers, because they are the people who come up with headings. I don't know whether you've come across headings in newspapers that say, the first black president, the first female neurophysicist, and so on and so on. So those headings to me suggest that there is something within society that's not right. If the first female neurophysicist becomes a heading, what does that say about society in terms of equity and treating everyone in the same way? Why are they becoming a heading now if things were equitable? So again, that's something we have to think about. And when we get to a stage where I'm not going to tell my grandchildren now to say, look, you have to work 3 times as hard just to be seen as equal. Now, those kind of things will take time to happen. But if we get to a point where we don't have those headings and where I don't have to tell my grandchildren all that, then I think as a society we would have moved, towards redressing what's happened. The other thing we have to do is not to be afraid of our history. And for us in a country like this, we have a colonial history, and we have to be able to relate to it. People who lived those days had a belief of why they did what they did, but now where we are now, we have to realize that maybe that was not the best way. But we can't dwell on that past. We should use the past to help us go forward. How then can we now go forward and redress the things that we see now as not right that happened in the past? So we cannot hold on to those things, but we use them to better ourselves and how we can live together as a society. And of course, difference is really important. I think we should use that difference and put it in a big, pool of expertise, knowledge, and make it work for us together as a society. That's probably the best way to address that. So we then don't have to have these unconscious bias. Yeah, we don't have that because we've worked through all that, and things just become normal, and we treat each other with respect and equally. And we have to realize, yes, we are all unique and we bring different things. Guy?
Yes, so I was actually thinking, yes, as you were speaking there, I was thinking about colonial history, and you know, we've heard a lot recently about slavery, and indeed when I first did my race equality training sort of 30 years or so ago, I remember being told, Guy, you need to, or me and others in the group, you need to remember that slavery is within living memory, in the sense that, you know, grandparents would have told about their experience of their fathers or their mothers being enslaved, but actually it's still there with us, and we have these much wider issues that affect us day by. We may not recognise them day by day, but there's a much more global kind of concept too, in terms of the hope for increasing awareness, but actually addressing still long-held historical prejudice and that's embedded in our kind of culture and our way of thinking and being. I don't know if you want to say anything more about that, Brian.
Yeah, I think everything, you know, like you say, there has got, you know, roots, explanations, and so on. Yeah, what happened then for me is historical, which, yeah, of course, now people look at it and think, oh, that was really wrong. How could you enslave other people? You know, but what now we need to do is to use that historical understanding and to better ourselves. We are in a position where we can do that because we now understand. And we know that if we work together, we're actually better for it. Yeah. So, you know, I don't want to make reference to what's happening across the Atlantic, but some of the things that were happening, maybe still happening across the Atlantic, is actually wanting to go back to, you know, historical colonial days, you know, where you actually have to openly discriminate against people, you know, and we don't want to be doing that. We want to actually say that was past, let's learn from it. And if we have a museum, let's put those things in a museum, you know, locked away somewhere. We can teach our children and grandchildren about what happened. You know, let's not display them out in the public because they are no longer, you know, seen as serving any good anymore. But the museum is in there, and we can do the same in organizations where practices and beliefs and treatment of people, you know, we can learn from. And then I think we have to decide what's the best way, and we have to get everybody, you know, involved. And the point I was making about the top table is really, really important, because until that is addressed, people are still going to be very suspicious about what happens in organizations. We heard it from our participants. Yeah, even if they promote us, it's like they want to tick their boxes. It's not genuine. Yeah, and that is probably quite true. Until the system changes, then people are still going to be very, very suspicious about the intentions of these, you know, promotions and things like that. So we have to make sure that, yeah, we get people promotions or get whatever they want to get to because they deserve it, they're prepared for it. Tokenism is really not the way, because it just ticks a box. It doesn't really serve the purpose.
Thanks very much for that, Brian. And yes, there's a lot more to do, isn't there? But Sophie, I think we have one more question.
Yeah.
I think.
We have one more question from Rhonda. Brian touched on mentoring by his line manager. What other mentoring can organizations put in place?
Right. So what other mentoring can organizations put in place. So the line manager who ended up becoming my mentor, right, was white manager who had an understanding of the issues that I was talking about. And when I actually started talking to him, I actually learned quite a lot about his upbringing. Yeah, with his mum, who was a nurse, he used to visit people in the community, sick people and so on. And so he was actually used to seeing his mum helping and supporting people. Now, I'm not suggesting that every mentor within the organization has got to have that kind of background, but it's important to have an understanding of people and what makes, you know, people, you know, tick. So as a mentor, I think the organization has got to train the mentors first about the values of the organization, and then also something about what it is to support another human being. And there has to be genuine support. You're not just doing it to tick a box. It's actually genuinely caring about the welfare of that person. And within that, he also, you know, my line manager mentor ended up actually saying to me as well, look, there is something here you don't understand. You need to get to grips with this so that it can also help you as you go along in society. So that was very honest and very understanding, and at the same time very supportive. So that's what organizations have got to do. They've got to do this training for the mentors. Now, if we're talking about people who are ethnically diverse, then there may be a reason to actually say, do we also have mentors who are ethnically diverse? You see somebody who looks like you may begin to have a little bit more faith in what's happening. Yeah, but I'm not advocating for entire mentorship of ethnically diverse people. No, I'm not. I'm saying let's have some who are ethnically diverse so that we can see the balance. We can see, you know, that the organization is serious about what it's doing. So it represents the workforce through the mentors themselves. How they look should reflect, you know, the workforce. Would you agree, Guy? Would you say something similar about that?
Most certainly, I'm sure that's we've got to have a diverse group of mentors as well. But what you say about the personal and establishing a relationship, and you referred to your mentor line manager saying, well, you know, Brian, you need to address this, and you found that was a really valuable lesson, valuable area to look at. Being open for both the mentor and the mentee, if that's the right phrase. You know, actually being able to receive as well as to be able to challenge in a gentle and an affirming way. One of the things that I find we lack sometimes is, or lack awareness of, is the ability to be appreciative, to thank people, and our stance should always be, I think, in terms of the appreciative inquiry approach, which is to start with those things that we wish to say that they're going well. It's not to neglect the many things that are perhaps being very challenging and are inequitable and all the rest, but we start from that appreciation. As people are thanked and appreciated for what they're doing, then we can begin to grow as staff and develop. So I'm just looking at the QA myself. I'm right, Safis, there's no other question, is that right?
Yes, that's correct. That was the last question.
So I did wonder just, Brian, as we enter the last few minutes, whether you would like to say, because one of the things about the Lishaw project is, of course, that we've been looking at the pandemic-related concerns and spiritual and religious concerns of ethnically diverse staff and how they've been affected in these last almost 2 years.
Yeah.
There's something around the pandemic from your own personal, perhaps professional view, in terms of how that really has, because there's been the sense of isolation, for instance, the fact that you know, we talked about ethnically diverse staff having to do twice as much as anyone else. Well, in these difficult days, I'm also hearing tragically that staff are being put into the front line, you know, rostered almost, ethnically diverse staff. Any sort of observations from the consultations we're doing you'd like to kind of finally comment on?
Yeah, thank you, Guy. I think what the pandemic has done is actually highlighted some of the disparities that happen, especially with ethnically diverse people working within the NHS. So we've had quite a lot of those issues highlighted now. For me, I think if what we hear that people have been rostered into the front line, and that was intentional because they are ethnically diverse, I think there is a real, people need to look at themselves if they did that. They really need to look at themselves, because this is a point of putting a mirror in front of you, introspection. Why would you do that? Why would you do that? And what I always believe in healthcare is that we look after each other as if you're looking after your own, you know, flesh and blood. And so that's the point, I think, here. If you were to do that to somebody else, then there is something really about you here that needs looking at. The system, obviously, within NHS is very supportive, but it needs people to use it accordingly. Now, what we've heard from the participants in the study is actually quite mixed. There were some who felt really well supported, and there's some who felt not so well supported. And some put it down to their managers or their matrons, you know, going by textbook style of dealing with issues. And that, in a way, is okay, but what textbook style does, it misses the individual variations that you come across. Because the textbook style says, when this happens, you do this, but it doesn't tell you about the individual, you know, differences that may happen. So it's about learning from that, but also building and being able to delve into individual differences, individual needs, aspirations, and so on and so on. I mean, the thing is, at the end of the day, you know, we all want to get to point B, and how we get there might be quite different. Some of us might want to walk, some might want to run, some might want to ride, and some might want to fly. So as an organization, we have to recognize those differences and enable people, facilitate people to use the most appropriate, convenient, comfortable way of getting to point B. And I think we will have success if we did that, pandemic or no pandemic.
Brian, thank you so much for all you've contributed this afternoon. Really very grateful indeed. It's a great place to end on in that sense, in terms of how we get to point B, whether we fly, we walk, or we crawl, or however it might be. But Juliet, I'm going to ask you just to say a few final words. Thank you. Yes, thank you, Guy. So thank you to both Guy and Brian for that really thoughtful conversation. This webinar is now nearly at an end. We would greatly appreciate any feedback you have about this webinar. Within the next couple of days, we'll email you a link to a very brief feedback form, and it would help us a great deal if you could just let us know anonymously what you think. And it would also, if you're willing to put any feedback in the question and answer section now, that would also be really helpful. Thank you. And we have 2 more webinars remaining in the series, which are coming up now. For full details, click on the link that I've put in the Q&A section, or go to the web address which is appearing on the slide now. Our next webinar will be Bringing Our Authentic Self to Work with Dr. Reno Vahora on Thursday, 17th of February, 4 till 5. And just a reminder that all of these webinars are being recorded and will be put on the webpage later. And with that in mind, thank you everyone for coming, and have a good evening.